Hello everyone, I hope you're all keeping well, healthy and happy. In today's video, I'm going to speak about the reasons why the world is in a state of chaos right now and what the heck is actually going on out there. Because we've spoken about the groups that have influenced the world in extraordinarily negative ways. But one thing I haven't really gotten around to explaining is the underpinning concepts or philosophies which guide these people to do what they do, i.e. to be self-destructive and destructive towards all other people, right? But before we can get into that, before we can understand chaos, we must first understand order, okay? What produces order? Well, that's going to be the first part of this video. And I'm going to talk about ethos, pathos, and logos, as was understood in Greek philosophy, in ancient Greek philosophy. Ethos is the moral understanding of a society or a person. Okay? It is the demonstration of mastery of self, the adherence to natural law. What is natural law? Well, it's a little bit complicated, but to give a brief understanding of this, all things go from order to chaos and chaos to order as per the second law of thermodynamics, okay? And what that means is that if you take a look at everything that happens in this universe, as well as the world that we live in, there are consequences to all actions. Every action, as Newton pointed out, has an equal but opposite reaction, okay? And this is fundamentally natural law in a nutshell. It branches out considerably more into many other aspects of life and existence, but that gives you a sense of it at least. Now, pathos is an interesting one. Because first you've got the ethos or the ethical underpinnings of society, then you've got pathos, which is the emotional experience of that society. It could be crystallized as being the concept of true care, okay? It's understanding suffering. In fact, the word that we use today, pathetic, means one who is given to suffering, one who is emotional, okay? And the word apathy, or to be apathetic, someone who is apathetic, means one who lacks that emotional experience or the ability to understand emotion, or more properly, one who does not care, who does not have true care. Okay? So you've got ethos and pathos. Then you've got possibly the most important out of the three, which is logos, right? Logos is the idea of speaking truth, right? It means the word or speech or discourse, okay? It's the principle of bringing order and knowledge into being within yourself, embodying those principles, right? That particular principle, as well as pathos and ethos. And it's also the reason why, for those of you that are keen Bible students, you'll know this. It's also the reason why Christ was referred to in the biblical scriptures as the Logos, right? He was the Word. He was speaking things into being. And the interesting thing about that, and I've said this before, is that we speak ourselves into being in a great many ways. And I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit later. This is how we establish internal order, okay? In fact, the word logic that we use today is derived from logos, okay? So by using logic, we establish internal order. And that just means to speak the truth and to speak as fully as we know how to have a proper discourse both within ourselves and with others. because human beings have many, many parts within them. That's something else I'll talk about a little bit later as well. But human beings have a lot of parts to them. Some of those parts are quite dark, okay? But we'll come back to that. So, as I say, the conceptualization of ethos, pathos, and logos gave rise to the Trivium, or the Trivium methodology, for conducting oneself both in society and for that society to conduct itself in general as well. And the Trivium consisted of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Okay? Grammar is to call things by their proper name. It means to differentiate. It is the beginning of establishing order both internally and externally. You could think of it as the structural rules that govern a society or an individual, or even in fact language. Most of you will be familiar with the word grammar from the way that we use it day to day, as in the grammar of English, right, or the grammar for English. The structural rules which we use when communicating, whether it's in written form or verbally or otherwise, there's grammatical rules, right? So it's the same concept, just on a larger scale. Logic. Okay, so we've spoken about grammar. Well, logic is the foundation of arguments which are supported by reason, knowledge, and order. Okay, i.e. things are ordered in a sequential sense, if you will, right? So that's grammar and logic of course coming from the logos means to speak the truth, right? So you're forming your arguments with logic. That's all logic is. Contrary to popular belief, logic does not necessarily yield the end result, but it's very useful for getting to the end result. Then you have rhetoric. Rhetoric is understanding and discovering and developing fully formed conclusions. So that's, once you've applied logic to the grammar, which is to call things by their proper name, then you can come to these conclusions and you share those conclusions. You communicate the conclusions with others, right? Which is why when people talk about rhetoric, even in a modern setting, in a modern context, it tends to mean to speak again. All of this is about speaking, by the way. So, you're communicating those conclusions to others in order to test their veracity. That's the important bit about this, right? So maybe you've come to some conclusions individually, but then you need to know if those conclusions are correct or not, so you've got to put them to the test, right? That's rhetoric, or at least it was in its original conception. So grammar, logic, and rhetoric. You could think of them in the following way, right? You could think of them this way. It's a little bit like, I don't know if any of you guys have ever taken computing classes, right? But it's like having an input, a process being applied to that input, and then obtaining an output from that, okay? So you could think of it as input, process, output. But that's grammar, logic, and rhetoric. It's the Trivium methodology, and this is what establishes order. It's also what creates our own individual identities. Okay, we form our identities using this particular method or these sorts of methods. And so the Trivium methodology, as I say, brings about order within you, and it also brings order externally into the world. Okay? And it conforms to natural law. Using this, you will see that human actions generally result in great good. Okay? It's a path towards goodness. Which is again why in biblical scripture, logos is central to that concept. Okay? It refers to the ancient Greek philosophy of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, okay? Or ethos, pathos, and logos, right? And this is also part of the reason why free speech is so incredibly important. Because how do you know whether you're right or wrong about something if you're not allowed to say that thing? Okay? And it's only by saying things, by speaking them into being, that we know who we are. Because we can either accept or reject ideas once they've been properly tried and tested. You see? But we still need to address chaos. Okay? Because we've spoken about order. That's what creates order. Proper order. Right? Now, the word order, by the way, has come to mean all sorts of nefarious things, and the reason being that you get these totalitarian orders, and people talk about the New World Order, right? So people have very negative connections or connotations with this word, but actually order is a very, very positive word. And I don't mean in the sense of a totalitarian order or New World Order. What we're talking about is having internal order within yourself, okay? And then allowing the world to take order in a proper and true fashion. It means the establishing of certain rules. It doesn't mean the absolute rulership of other people. Okay, it doesn't mean other rulers to rule over you. That's slavery, right? What we're talking about is an ordered society, right? You need rules to function. And we'll get to why you need those rules in a second as well, right? Because these are enormously complex concepts that we're dealing with. But as I say, there's an inverse methodology to the one we've spoken about. And that inverse methodology brings about chaos and suffering and destruction and internal anarchy. And that methodology, although strictly speaking it's not a methodology, it's simply an idea, I suppose, is nihilism. And I've talked about this quite a lot, but I don't think I've ever properly explained it. Nihilism is the belief that nothing matters, right? That nothing you do matters. And therefore, there is no such thing as good and evil. Okay? All things, in a nihilistic sense, from a nihilistic perspective, all things become relative. Now, here's the problem with nihilism, right? And why it's such a difficult ideology to combat. Because in the ultimate sense, it's absolutely true. Right? If you think of it from this perspective, and I've touched on this briefly before, we exist today, but we're going to die at some point, right? We'll be dead and buried in 6 feet under the ground, all of us. So, does anything you do in life matter? Right? And you can take that to an even more extreme conclusion where you can say, well, the entire universe is going to end someday, possibly. The Earth is certainly going to die at some stage. The sun is going to die off, right? So, why should we care what we do? Right? It's a very, very insidious type of idea, this, right? But I'm explaining it like this for a reason. It's to help you understand how easy it is to get caught in the nihilistic trap, right? But as I say, in the ultimate sense, that's true. Okay, if you were looking from a completely outside perspective, i.e. if you didn't exist and you could look in, which is a contradiction in itself, right? It's a paradox, really. Nihilism is a paradoxical worldview. That's what's interesting about it. It actually doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But you can see part of why people might think like that, right? And it's a very abstract idea, basically. And in an abstract sense, it actually does make sense, as I say. But because we can't look in from an external perspective, it's not as if you cannot exist and still see what's going on, right? That's the problem with nihilism. It would require your non-existence. But let's say that even if that were true, that you somehow could, and it requires a whole lot of magical thinking, by the way, but let's say you could. Looking in and looking at this world, right? You could make the argument, well, it's all for naught. Why should we bother living, right? But the problem with this idea, even if it held absolutely true, is that it's completely useless. and self-destructive because it destroys your individual identity. It's useless for the experience of being. This is why I'm saying it's paradoxical, right? Because you do exist and you are here right now, regardless of how you might, explain that or how you might come to terms with that, right? Regardless of how that happens, you do exist. Okay? And therefore, your very experience of being, of existing, means that you have to make certain types of observations. And those will be value judgments that you make. Okay? It is impossible to take a completely relative tact in life. This is part of the reason why, and I was going to get into this a little bit later on, but it's part of the reason why you see socialists and leftists and communists constantly contradicting themselves. Okay, it's because they'll say something, but they'll never ever be able to adhere to that particular idea because its roots are in nihilism. And this is part of the reason why, as I say, you see these contradictions, these paradoxical relationships between people who advocate for these ideologies, but at the same time, they themselves can't conform to them. You see? But it's a destructive concept, nihilism, right? As I say, it destroys your individual identity, but it also destroys collective identity as well. And collective identity is equally as important, by the way. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, right? Because we need those identities to function in the world. That's the thing. Because people need to be able to designate us as something, and we need to be able to designate ourselves as something as well. And when the two things align, that's when you find real objective reality coming into being, right? It's like, okay, that makes sense. But if everything's purely subjective and nothing matters and everything is just useless and no good, then, again, that's not a state of mind. It's not a philosophy that can easily work in the world at all, in real terms. But here's again where nihilism stems from. It's as I say, an insidious form of thought. It stems from an even more bizarre idea, which is this: there are an infinite number of ways to interpret something. And that because there are an infinite number of ways to interpret something, there is no correct way to interpret something. Okay? That's a very interesting proposition on the part of nihilists. It is, of course, patently false, though, right? Because here's the thing. If you have a subjective interpretation of a specific thing, and it serves no utility in your life whatsoever, at all, then it's clearly wrong. Okay, if you've got a subjective worldview and it does nothing to improve your life, it does nothing to improve anyone else's life, it could not even potentially have any benefits, then that is clearly the wrong way to think. And a concrete example of this. Imagine if I believed that a pumpkin should turn into a unicorn. Okay? It doesn't matter how much I wish it into being, or how much I believe that. It will never ever turn into a unicorn. Okay? And this is the sort of postmodernist form of thinking which bizarrely enough inspired the ideologies of socialism and communism. And that's why they exist, to create chaos. Right? Because nihilism leads automatically to chaos because you can't establish internal order, you can't establish external order. It's just total pure chaos where nothing is reasoned, nothing is sequential, nothing is logical. It just descends into utter madness, quite frankly. It's a sort of a fantasist worldview. And this same fantasist worldview exists in Islam. It actually exists in most fundamentalist religions, by the way, right? Which are either eschatological in nature or share a utopian worldview, right? And those utopian worldviews come about because people aren't realists, and it's because they live in these subjective, solipsistic kind of bubbles, if you will, right? And those come about because of a nihilistic philosophy, as I've outlined. So that's the thing of that. But why do these ideas destroy identity? Well, because, as I've outlined, your identity is built upon a sequential order of things, right? When you were born, right, if you're lucky enough to be born into a family where you have parents, right, that are still alive and that have raised you, they'll have given you a name. Now, 9 times out of 10, you will not have chosen that name, right? So, you've been designated. And in turn, they didn't choose their last name, right? And so on. So, you've got a name, you've got an identity, okay? You've got a heritage, you know who your mother and father are in most cases. And if you don't, then that's incredibly unfortunate. And again, by the way, kids that are adopted often have the toughest time having a strong sense of self, having a strong identity, right? Because our identity is built upon these things. So, as I say, this sequential order, the way in which things happen, natural law, right? The way that the world works requires that we fit in somewhere in that sequence of events, which is why we matter. Okay, it's also why everything we do in life matters. Okay, everything we do in life matters because of this, because there are consequences to our actions. And it's because there are consequences to our actions, because of the things that we learn, like if we do this, then this will happen, right? That's how we build up our idea of who we are, what we can do and what we cannot do, right? Whether it's trying to transgress the moral laws or the physical laws or whatever else, right? We learn very quickly the do's and don'ts, right? And sometimes we feel like breaking rules just to see if we can break them, right? Which is no bad thing necessarily, depending on what those rules are, right? Provided that you're not encroaching into someone else's rights or someone else's freedom, quite honestly, right? Because then you're just inflicting suffering, which again has a consequence. So in either case, if one is sensible enough, you'll learn from that, okay? But there are cases in which someone's identity can be absolutely and completely shattered, okay? And that usually results from, as I say, some sort of event happening which throws everything into chaos, or it results from the worldview that they might hold, which could be nihilistic. So they might be in chaos because of that, right? But chaos is a state in which your identity is completely shattered into pieces. Let me tell you what human identity is, by the way. Anyone's identity, right? You think you are a singular person. You're watching this video, for example, and you think you're a singular person with coherent singular thoughts. You're not. Not remotely. Okay? You have many parts to who you are. Many, many parts. Okay? And they're all talking to each other. Right? They're all talking to each other. All the synapses and the different parts of your brain, they're all in communication constantly. Right? Which is why you can function. Okay? Like if I want to move my hand, okay, the signals are sent from my brain to my hand, and then from my hand to my brain to acknowledge that I've done the thing, right? And there's all of these sensory perceptions that I have, which tell me that that's taken place. And there's the spatial awareness side of things as well, A lot of things are going on there, right? But those are millions and billions and trillions of bits of me, right? Down to the cellular level that are all in communication. So you have many parts, as I say, to yourself. It's not just quite as simple as that's you and that's it. No, there's all sorts of things going on, not only in the brain, in your skull, but throughout your body, right? To give an example of this, if you're afflicted with an illness, God forbid, but if you ever are, you'll notice that it completely saps your mood. Okay? It makes you irritable. Doesn't it? Even though before the illness might have set in, you were a completely different person. Or at least you thought you were, right? Actually, no, both of those people are you. It's just different parts of you coming out as a result of various interactions taking place. Okay? And various things happening to you. Right? What's my point with this? Well, you have the you that you know, which is rational and logical, okay? And you also have the you that you don't know, which is a part of your subconscious, which is your creative aspect, right? Then you have, it's far more complex than this again. If you want to get a good handle on it, you should study Carl Jung's work. That's what I would recommend, right? Or Freud. But the point being that you have all of those parts, then you have darker parts of yourself as well, right? That's the shadow side of self that Carl Jung spoke about. And I've talked about this quite a lot myself. So what happens is the nihilistic philosophy appeals to that shadow side. And the shadow side is enormously destructive. It just wants to do things for the heck of it. Okay? And sometimes it will get the better of you, by the way, if you're not aware of it. Okay? And this self-destructive idea, as I say, is very, very attractive to the shadow side. Right? Because the shadow side finds great joy in malevolence. Okay? So people who have not integrated their shadow side into their whole self oftentimes find that the shadow side ends up absolutely ruling over their actions. Okay? But getting back to the thing we were speaking about, which is identity. Here's the thing about identity, right? It can be very easily shattered into various pieces, right? It doesn't take a genius to be able to do that. The CIA did that, in fact, with MKUltra many years ago. They were experimenting with this, using LSD and various other psychotropic drugs, okay? The point being that your identity is very fragile. The identity, i.e. that holistic sense of self that you have, is very, very fragile. Right? If it splinters too much, if it shatters too much, you can develop multiple personality disorder. Right? But there are other ways for it to shatter as well, where different bits of you just completely take over. That happens. And so this is what you might call psychotic possession, or even ideological possession to a lesser degree, right? Which is why I talk about ideological possession so much, because that happens. It happens to people, right? That's why you see all these malevolent forces, because they've given into the nihilistic philosophy. They've given into the idea that chaos should rule over mankind. Because nothing matters, so just let it all go to hell. Why not launch nuclear missiles at every country and just kill off humankind? Right? That's nihilism. And that's why the world is in the state that it's in. Right? Because we've abandoned. Here's what's happened. See, as I said, the Greek philosophers came up with these ideas, the Roman Stoics took them up, then eventually we had, through the Western Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment which happened, these ideas being enshrined into our institutions and so forth. But then a group of nihilists came on to the scene, right? And they decided to develop their own ideologies. One of those being socialism, as I've discussed. I mean, you can look this up in my other videos. I've explained this in great detail in depth. But the point being that those ideologies then started to infiltrate into Western Europe and into Western society. So what you ended up getting were a whole bunch of nihilists basically taking over. And then deconstructing the ordered way that things were done. And this started happening, by the way, in the early 20th century. Okay, this hasn't existed for very long, by the way. This is another thing that people get wrong very often. This drive towards chaos, the subversion of the normal, if you will, processes, that has only been happening for the last 150 years. Okay, it's all relatively brand new. It's not quite as ancient as people think it is. Of course, they take their cues from the people that were around in Babylon and the Tower of Babel and so forth, but that's a whole different discussion in a different video, perhaps. But the point is that the destruction of individual identities and then the destruction of group identities is what these people are after. Because they believe in it so strongly and so wholly. Right? And what happens is that these different ideas tend to gravitate towards each other, which is why you get Islam and Islamism joining forces so strongly with cultural Marxists, with communists, with socialists. Because they all just want to destroy. That's the thing. And there's only a very small number of people, by the way, who want to preserve anything. And most people are asleep. I've said this many, many times. Many other excellent commentators have said the same thing, right? Most people today are completely and utterly asleep. They do not want to know the truth about what is going on. They don't want to know the truth about themselves. What do you think happens to a society when the majority of the population adopts the very same nihilistic principles as the forces of evil, as the forces of chaos? Do you think that civilization can survive in those circumstances? No. Okay? It simply can't. It doesn't matter how few people stand up even and speak the truth. If the majority doesn't, then the whole thing goes under. That's the reality, you know? And so what are we going to see in the world from this point on? What are we going to see? Are we going to see civilization save itself? That's very unlikely. Okay? In the long term, it's very unlikely. Okay? If you'll pardon my being a pessimist about this. Why is it unlikely? Because most people want to die. This sounds like a strange thing to say. That's going to shock some of you. Most people want to die. Because they've given up. They've given up on life. They've given up on their families. They've given up on the people they love. They've given up on their governments. Everyone has given up. They have lost their courage. They've lost their strength. They have become weak. And they have become cowards. And they were made that way, by the way. I can't really blame them for it. They were made to be that way. I was reading a thing just the other day, in fact. I'm going off on a tangent here a little bit, but I hope you'll bear with me. I was reading in a publication the other day that the sperm counts for Western men have dropped off a cliff. They've dropped by 50%. That's really serious. Okay, because these principles of the Western Enlightenment, the only people that held to these were the West. They were Western peoples. Everyone else has rejected or abandoned them. These concepts and principles that we're talking about, grammar, logic, rhetoric, ethos, pathos, the logos, right? Everyone else has abandoned them. Do you think that most people in the world today, the world is full of 7.2 billion people, do you think most of them value free speech? Or are they all vying for totalitarian control in whichever region of the world they find themselves in? There's a question for you. Okay? So the only people that value these ideas are Western peoples. But what's happened is, as I say, the sperm counts have dropped off a cliff. Western male testosterone has dropped so significantly in the last 50 years that there's no masculine energy left in Western men anymore. They don't want to defend their civilization anymore. Now, you're going to get outraged about my saying this, right? And you should. And you should be outraged that this has been allowed to happen, because guess what this is? This is eugenics. That's eugenics. Or dysgenics, maybe. That's what's going on. It's eugenics playing out. Okay? The easiest way to kill off ideas is to kill off the people who believe in those ideas, who support those ideas. Okay? That's how ideas die. And that's how freedom of speech will die. And freedom of expression will die. Because people will just let it happen. They've become apathetic. They no longer have true care for anyone or anything. We were talking about that earlier. Okay, they no longer care. They can't bring themselves to care because it just seems like, what does it matter? Okay, that's how they're looking at it. What does it matter? That's nihilism, right? Like we talked about, but there you go. So unless the majority of the populations in the West start waking up and start actually truthfully standing up for the very same things that their ancestors fought and died for, to protect those rights, to protect those freedoms, to protect the ideas, to make sure those ideas proliferate, then what do you think's going to happen? And isn't it interesting that, see, all this stuff that we're talking about, none of it is talked about in schools. None of it is taught in schools at all. Why is that? Parents should be asking these questions. Teachers should be asking these questions if they're not ideologically possessed. Okay? Why are kids not being taught the basics of life? Instead, what are they being taught? Well, not only are they being indoctrinated with garbage right now, as I've talked about many, many times, subjectivist, solipsistic garbage that caters to narcissistic tendencies, right? Not only are they being taught all of that, but they're being taught relativism on top of it. Right? How can we expect people to want to defend something if there's nothing to defend? Because today, if you go out there and you ask somebody, what do you stand for? They'll shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know. That's how bad it's gotten. You know, people have no sense of identity left, either individually or in groups anymore. And I'm not suggesting that group identity is always necessarily 100% a good thing. What I'm saying is that you need to have a sense of identity at least. Right? It doesn't mean you have to go out there and say, well, it doesn't mean you have to become a supremacist, right? It just means you go out there and you acknowledge the fact that you have an identity, you have a group, be it whatever group it is. It can be an ethnic group, right? It can be another kind of group. As long as you never ever sacrifice your self-identity for the group. Because again, that leads to groupthink and then tyranny again and totalitarian control. You don't want that, right? But it becomes an inevitability when you erase all traces of identity from people. When you don't let people express who they are. When people just speaking about something, or somebody writes a book about something and you want to ban it or burn it. That's what leads to the destruction of entire civilizations. And that's not a good thing. Anyway, I'll leave it there for this video. But I wanted to try and get this across to people, how important it is to understand these concepts that are rooted deeply in ancient philosophy, because that's the way that you establish internal order, as I say, and it's the way that you keep everything alive. You keep refreshing civilization. We failed to do that for the last 50, 60 years. And the only inevitable end result of all of that is going to be the destruction of civilization if we're not careful. And as I say, if the West dies off, if Western European people die off, and their ideas, more importantly, die off, and they're replaced by totalitarian ideologies that demand the killing and beheading of people, which is going on right now in Britain, by the way. It's going on in Western Europe right now, Germany, France, Sweden. I could go on. If these kind of ideologies replace good ideologies, good ideas even, what do you think's going to happen? So that's why I'm talking about this. We have to reject nihilism completely and utterly. Nihilism has no place in these societies, in civilization, because it's antithetical to civilization. And we have to shake these people that believe in nihilism so strongly. We have to shake them awake and say, no, you will not establish chaos in our world. You will not do that. You have no right to do that. Just because you're messed up psychologically, because you're psychopathic enough to want to kill off people and destroy the planet, doesn't mean that we're willing to do it. We have to have some strength behind us, and if it comes down to having to physically fight people that want to try and cause us harm, then that's what you have to do. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Take good care of yourselves, and God bless.